Tasha had been looking forward to a relaxing flight from New York to Los Angeles after a hectic week of meetings. She had booked a first-class seat, expecting comfort and a stress-free journey. However, upon reaching her assigned seat, row 2A, she was stopped by a flight attendant who insisted that the seat was reserved for someone else. Confused, Tasha showed her boarding pass, but the flight attendant remained firm, saying she needed to move. Tasha asked her to check again, but the attendant's response was the same. Unsettled, Tasha asked to speak to someone else. The senior flight attendant arrived, listened to the situation, and went to consult the captain. Tasha felt increasingly uneasy as passengers observed the scene, wondering if something deeper was at play. Was she being singled out because of her race? The thought crossed her mind, but she tried to stay calm. Minutes later, the senior flight attendant returned, apologizing for the confusion, but still insisting that she move. Tasha remained firm, unwilling to move without further explanation. The captain arrived soon after and explained that Tasha's seat had been mistakenly given to another passenger who hadn't boarded yet. He assured her that they were trying to sort it out and asked her to sit elsewhere in the meantime. Tasha, frustrated but still composed, insisted she would not move until she understood exactly what was happening. She reluctantly took a different seat, her discomfort growing as she observed the crew whispering among themselves. Tasha couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Was this just a mistake, or was there a deeper issue at play? As the minutes dragged on, Tasha sensed that the situation was spiraling, and she was part of something larger than a mere seating mix-up. Despite the captain's reassurances, the entire interaction felt off, and Tasha remained on edge, trying to make sense of what was happening. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and Tasha couldn't help but wonder what the outcome would be. Would this situation be resolved, or would it escalate further? As she sat, the feeling that she was being treated differently lingered, and she was left questioning what was truly behind the events unfolding around her. The flight attendants were whispering to each other, exchanging looks that Tasha couldn't ignore. Something wasn't right, and she couldn't help but wonder how far this situation would go. Was this just an overblown misunderstanding, or was there something deeper happening? The flight attendant's behavior had been odd from the start. Tasha thought about Emma's coldness, the way she blocked her from her seat, and insisted Tasha move without even bothering to check the ticket. It had all felt deliberate. As the plane filled with the usual bustle of activity, passengers noticed Tasha, but did nothing to intervene. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but she also couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger than just a seat issue was at play. Perhaps a breakdown in how people were treated based on assumptions and biases. When the plane doors closed and the flight was ready to take off, Tasha was still in her seat, feeling the heavy tension that filled the cabin. Nothing felt normal. As the plane ascended, Emma returned to the aisle, but she was holding a clipboard, not the usual tray of drinks or snacks. Tasha's stomach dropped when she saw her. It was clear something had changed, but she wasn't sure what it was. Emma walked to the front of the cabin where the senior flight attendant and captain had previously spoken. Tasha could see that Emma was being dismissed. There was no apology, just the hard reality of someone losing their job. The gravity of the situation began to sink in for Tasha. What had started as a small issue with a seat assignment had now escalated into something much larger. The senior flight attendant turned to Tasha and told her that her seat would be returned to her shortly, but that there had been a more serious issue with Emma's conduct. Tasha's heart raced. She hadn't expected any of this. She thought Emma would apologize and things would return to normal, but instead, she found herself in the middle of a much more serious situation. The senior flight attendant continued, explaining that Emma's actions were not in line with the airline standards and that she would be leaving the plane. Tasha sat in stunned silence, watching Emma gather her belongings. It was surreal. One simple action, one refusal, had led to the loss of a job. Tasha wasn't sure how to feel. Part of her felt a sense of justice, but another part of her felt uneasy. It wasn't just Emma who had made a mistake. It was the assumptions that had been made about Tasha because of her appearance. A woman of color sitting in first class was seen as out of place. That assumption had cost someone their career, and it left Tasha with a strange, uncomfortable feeling of guilt. As Emma walked down the aisle, her head hung low. There was no exchange of words between her and Tasha. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Tasha didn't feel satisfaction watching Emma leave. She only felt sadness and a sense of unease. The entire situation had unfolded so quickly, and now the consequences were clear. One simple mistake had led to a cascade of events that no one could have predicted. As the flight continued, Tasha sat back in her seat, her thoughts in a whirl. The plane had settled into its routine. The seatbelt sign switched off, and passengers were stretching in their seats. But Tasha couldn't shake the heaviness that lingered in the air. She kept replaying the events in her mind. How something as simple as a question about her seat had escalated into this. She had expected a peaceful flight, but instead she found herself at the center of a situation that had much more to do with race, assumptions, and the consequences of those assumptions than with the seat she had been assigned. As she sat there, she couldn't help but think about Emma's dismissive attitude, the coldness in her voice, and the assumption that someone like Tasha didn't belong in first class. Tasha realized that it wasn't just about her seat. It was about the larger issue of how people were treated differently, based on who they were, how they looked, and the biases that shaped those perceptions. What had started as a small misunderstanding had turned into a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained those biases could be. And now, Tasha was left to process the fallout, unsure of how to feel about the events that had just transpired, but knowing they had changed everything. Tasha's experience on the flight had started as a simple seating issue, but quickly escalated into something much larger. The confrontation with the flight attendant had been fueled by a dismissive attitude that was hard to ignore. It wasn't just about the seat, it was the tone, the immediate dismissal, and the feeling that Tasha's presence was an inconvenience. Tasha had expected a simple, uneventful flight, but instead, she found herself questioning much more profound issues. Initially, Tasha felt relieved when the situation was resolved, but she couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that lingered. She had not wanted the flight attendant to lose her job over a seating misunderstanding. However, as she thought more about it, Tasha realized that the flight attendant's actions went beyond a simple mistake. The flight attendant's refusal to allow her to sit in her assigned seat was rooted in assumptions based on race and class, things Tasha had always navigated but never fully gotten used to. Tasha had worked hard to reach her position in life, and she wasn't going to let anyone, not even a flight attendant, make her feel inferior. Yet, seeing the flight attendant escorted off the plane left Tasha conflicted. Was she wrong to stand up for herself? Was it right that the flight attendant had lost her job? Could the situation have been handled differently? As the flight continued, Tasha tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to what had just happened. She could sense the passengers around her, some whispering, others pretending nothing had occurred, all watching as the flight attendants moved with an uncharacteristic, nervous energy. Tasha felt exposed, like an outsider in a space where she had every right to be. Even though she had done everything right, paid for her seat, followed the rules, she felt stripped of the fairness and respect she had fought so hard to receive. The flight attendants now seemed uneasy, walking the aisle with a jittery energy. Tasha couldn't help but wonder if they were just as shaken by the events as she was. Did they understand what had caused the fallout? Or were they just trying to keep the situation from escalating further? For the first time in a long time, Tasha felt completely out of place, even though she had done nothing wrong. The flight had been marred by something much larger than a seating issue. It was about bias, assumptions, and discrimination, all of which Tasha had been forced to confront. She glanced at the empty space where the flight attendant had been standing and felt a pang of sympathy. Tasha didn't want the flight attendant to lose her job. It wasn't about revenge, but she understood that biases, whether intentional or not, had consequences. Sometimes those consequences were unavoidable. Tasha had fought hard to break barriers in her life, and she knew that the flight attendant, perhaps without realizing it, had contributed to a system that perpetuated those very barriers. The more Tasha thought about it, the more she realized that her actions had been part of something much bigger than a simple seating issue. By standing up for herself, Tasha had inadvertently confronted uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and race. As the plane descended into Los Angeles, Tasha's thoughts had slowed. She no longer had all the answers, but she understood one thing. Things had changed, not just for her, but for everyone who had witnessed the incident. In a strange way, she felt a sense of power, not because she had won, but because she had spoken up when something wasn't right. She had stood up for fairness, even if it was uncomfortable. The moment the plane touched down, Tasha gathered her things, feeling a quiet resolve settle over her. She didn't have to know everything now, but standing up for herself had been something she could be proud of. However, when the plane reached the gate, Tasha felt exposed again. Passengers began to gather their things, and Tasha could sense that some of them had been watching the whole situation unfold. The subtle glances, the hushed whispers. She felt like she had become part of a narrative she hadn't asked for. Her small personal ordeal had turned into something larger than herself. As Tasha stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she tried to shake off the weight of what had just happened. But it lingered. She couldn't escape the truth that had come with the situation. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about assumptions and discrimination that had shaped the entire encounter. She was a black woman in first class, and that seemed to trigger assumptions about whether she truly belonged there. Tasha had paid for the seat, followed the rules, and expected nothing more than respect, yet she was treated as though she didn't belong. While walking through the terminal, Tasha checked her phone and saw a notification from social media. Flight attendant fired after refusing black passenger first class seat. Her stomach tightened. The story had gone viral. As she read through the posts, she saw a flood of opinions, some supportive, others critical. The debate had grown into something larger than her personal experience, touching on issues of race, privilege, and class. Many saw Tasha as a hero, but others questioned whether the flight attendant's firing was justified. Some even suggested that Tasha had overreacted, while others believed she had stirred up trouble on purpose. The video of the incident had gone viral, with blurry footage capturing the tense exchange between Tasha and the flight attendant. The comments focused on why the flight attendant had been so quick to dismiss Tasha, and many debated whether her actions had been a deliberate refusal or simply a mistake. Some people criticized Tasha for overreacting, while others claimed that she had gotten the flight attendant fired intentionally. Tasha felt a mix of anger and frustration as the situation, which had initially felt like a personal issue, was now dissected and judged in ways she couldn't control. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about race, privilege, and assumptions. As Tasha approached the airport exit, she noticed a group of people holding phones, pointing them in her direction. Her anxiety spiked, and she quickly turned to avoid their gaze. It was clear that the story had become bigger than she had anticipated, and she now found herself part of a much larger conversation, one she hadn't asked for but would have to confront. She had become a symbol of something larger, something she hadn't signed up for, and now she would have to face the consequences. In the days that followed, Tasha tried to return to normal, but the impact of the viral video followed her. News outlets, social media, and even talk shows picked up the story, and Tasha found herself at the center of a national conversation about race, privilege, and bias. Her inbox was flooded with messages from strangers, some offering support, others criticizing her actions or questioning her role in getting the flight attendant fired. But the messages that troubled her most were from people who misunderstood her entirely, accusing her of seeking attention or inflating the situation for personal gain. Tasha had never wanted any of this. She just wanted the seat she had paid for and to be treated with respect. Tasha's experience on a plane, where she was unfairly treated by a flight attendant, quickly became more than a personal incident. It sparked a wider conversation about racial bias, particularly against Black women, in everyday public spaces like airports and airplanes. What began as a simple seating issue grew into a national debate, with Tasha's story becoming a focal point for discussions on racial discrimination. Although overwhelmed by the attention, Tasha recognized that her experience was part of a much larger issue and couldn't ignore the opportunity to help drive change. As media coverage intensified, Tasha's role evolved from a victim of bias to a catalyst for a much-needed dialogue about race and systemic discrimination. She realized that her story was not just about her, but about the daily discrimination faced by many people of color. The overwhelming support from others who shared similar experiences made Tasha more determined to keep speaking out, even as the responses from critics were harsh and polarized. Despite the criticism, she saw the value in using her voice for a larger cause. Tasha soon became involved in organizations focused on racial justice and inclusion. Though hesitant at first, she began to speak at events and share her story in broader conversations about systemic bias. She realized that her platform was not about defending herself, but about challenging societal assumptions and bringing attention to issues of racial inequality. Tasha's small act of standing up for herself had resonated with many, turning her into a symbol of a larger movement. However, as the media frenzy died down, Tasha faced the emotional and physical toll of her new role. She began to feel the weight of being a public figure, advocating for racial justice, and understood that taking care of herself was essential to continuing her work. After reflecting on her journey, she took a break to recharge and reconnect with her personal life. Despite the challenges, Tasha realized that her voice could continue to make a difference. She understood that her story had sparked a larger conversation about race, bias, and equity that was far from over. Tasha was committed to keeping that conversation alive, whether through social media, speaking engagements, or personal interactions, knowing that the fight for racial justice was just beginning. During her break, Tasha began to reassess her role in the ongoing conversation about racial injustice and discrimination. Initially, she had been driven by the urgency to share her personal story. But as she reflected, she realized the importance of listening. She understood that her experience, though impactful, was just one part of a much larger puzzle. Her voice had sparked conversations about race, but she also recognized the need to create spaces for others to share their own stories. The collective goal was clear: equality, respect, and the ability to exist in spaces without judgment based on appearance, background, or assumptions. Tasha realized that her journey wasn't just about sharing her experience repeatedly. It was about amplifying the voices of others, especially those who had been silenced. She had seen firsthand the power of personal stories in driving change, and now she wanted to create opportunities for others to be heard. As her perspective shifted, Tasha began collaborating with organizations already working on racial justice and equality. No longer was it only about her individual experience. It became about collective action, mutual support, and contributing to the broader fight for fairness in public spaces. Her role in the conversation evolved as well. Tasha no longer viewed herself simply as the subject of the conversation, but as an active participant in shaping it. She began to see her experience as a tool not only for advocacy, but for building connections between people with shared goals. She used her platform to draw attention to the work that was already being done and to foster collaboration. This was about creating bridges, not just raising awareness. It was about fostering solidarity, using her voice to empower others rather than focusing solely on her own narrative. Her path had taken unexpected turns, but she embraced her new role with confidence. Tasha had always been someone who stood up for herself, but she now found herself learning how to stand up for others in ways she had never anticipated. The journey had challenged her, but it had also deepened her understanding of what it meant to fight for justice and equality. And although the road ahead was still uncertain, for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt at peace with her journey. She had also learned the importance of self-care amidst the demands of activism. Tasha realized that to continue the work she was passionate about, she needed to nurture her own well-being. This meant creating space to rest, reflect, and recharge. By striking this balance, she was able to sustain herself and her efforts in a way that was both impactful and healthy. She understood that self-care wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity for long-term success in advocacy and activism. Months later, Tasha found herself at a national conference on racial equity, standing before a packed room of activists, advocates, and professionals from various sectors. She had spoken at similar events before, but this time felt different. She had changed. Over the past year, her journey had been transformative, not just because of the awareness she had raised, but because of the personal growth she had experienced. Tasha had come to understand that being part of a movement was not only about raising her voice, but also about listening, learning, and understanding the struggles of others. As she prepared to speak, she reflected on everything that had brought her to this point. Her experience had evolved from a personal incident to a broader conversation about systemic injustice. It was no longer about her individual story. It was about the larger system of biases that affected people of color in public spaces. As Tasha stepped up to the podium, she felt a sense of calm. Her words were steady, filled with passion, but not tinged with the anxiety she once had. She had become accustomed to sharing her story, but this time her message was different. "This past year has been a whirlwind," Tasha began, her voice strong but emotional. She paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle over the room. What started as a simple misunderstanding on a flight led to something much bigger. It became a conversation, one about race, bias, and the assumptions we make about each other every day. She continued, "But what I've learned over the past year is that this conversation isn't just about one flight attendant or one person's story. It's about a system. It's about all the microaggressions, the biases, the assumptions that shape how we move through the world. And it's about all of us, each of us, taking responsibility for changing that system." The room fell silent as Tasha's words sank in. Her message was no longer just about personal experience. It was about collective responsibility. Tasha spoke not just as a victim, but as an active participant in a movement for change. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, acknowledging that the work of social justice sometimes finds you. "But when it does, you have a choice. Ignore it or stand up, speak out, and be part of the change." Her words resonated deeply. No longer just the woman wronged on a plane, Tasha had become a symbol of collective action. She emphasized that this was a long-term struggle, not a one-time issue, requiring daily efforts to challenge biases and continue the dialogue. The movement she represented was about dismantling systemic inequality through persistence and action. Tasha's speech ended with a powerful call to action. "This is our moment to make a difference. We can't afford to be silent. We must challenge our biases and work toward a more inclusive world." The audience erupted in applause, and Tasha felt her journey had come full circle. She had transformed from a victim to a key figure in an evolving movement for change. Afterward, people approached her to express their gratitude and share their own stories. Tasha felt pride not in her own actions, but in the collective effort to create real change. Reflecting that evening, She realized her journey was never just about the viral incident that brought her attention. It was about building a future where everyone felt they truly belonged, regardless of race or background. Tasha continued to balance her advocacy work with quiet reflection. She understood that the fight for justice wasn't about recognition, but about making a tangible difference. Through her efforts, Tasha had become part of a movement that was gaining momentum every day, aiming to create lasting change for generations to come.